Hi everyone, thank you for all joining. My name is Özgür Can Seçkin or Ozgur. I'd like to welcome you all to Observatory on Social Media's awesome speaker event. Before we get started, I'd just like to talk about the observatory quickly. Um, sorry. For those who are learning about the for those who are learning about us for the first time, the OSoMe or Observatory on Social Media is an interdisciplinary research group that is interested in all things at the intersection of media, technology, and especially with a focus on social media. We conduct rigorous academic research, build analytic tools and software for both scientists and journalists, and work to educate the next generation of computationally skilled media professionals. We encourage you to visit our website to learn more about our latest research, uh, papers and tools and anything else. As a part of the observatory's interdisciplinary mission, we have organized the Awesome Speakers virtual event. The event consists of a series of talks from some of the brightest researchers and scholars who are working to rigorously understand how social media, the internet, and technology impact the world. Please make sure that you check out the event page on our website. You can see the URL on the screen for more information on past and future talks. If you find the topic of this talk interesting, I'm sure you'll be interested in the other speakers we have lined up or have had the pleasure of hosting in the past. With that, let me introduce Peter Törnberg. It's my pleasure to introduce him. He studies the intersection of AI, social media, and politics at the University of Amsterdam. His recent books include Intimate Communities of Hate, Why Social Media Fuels Far-Right Extremism, and Seeing Like a Platform, an inquiry into the condition of digital modernity. Today, Peter will discuss studying digital media in the post-social media era. However, before we start, I'll remind everyone of the typical structure of our talks. So the presentation will last about 45 minutes, and we get the questions at the end, and we have like 15 minutes for the discussion. And feel free to leave the questions in the chat or save them to ask later. I'll now ask that we welcome Peter, and while we switch screens, and Peter, you should now be able to share your screen. And please give a zoom. Yes, exactly. Let me stop
Thank you
share.
so much for the kind introduction and for inviting me. It's a lot to live up to. This awesome speaker. We'll see we'll see how awesome I am. It's also late evening here, or not that late, but it's been a long day. So if I seem a little bit mushy at some point, you'll have to excuse me. Yeah. So this talk it'll be a little bit different for my I guess most of my talk, because I won't just go over my existing research. I'll actually do a little bit of a provocation and be kind of thinking through some ideas that I've been working on around how the transformations we're seeing in the social media landscape right now. And it's I realize it's a little bit of a provocation, especially speaking to the observatory on social media, saying that the social media era is over. But that's basically the argument that I'll be trying to make. But I'll be enjoying the 15 minutes of discussion with you. But the basic claim that I want to go through in this presentation is this idea that social media basically has been the lens through which we've understood digital media and the internet over the last 20 or so years. And it's become a kind of chief metaphor for understanding media these days, but also kind of for shaping certain methods, right? And my claim will be that this era is ending. I will point to various things to argue for this claim. So one thing being that social media platforms are, as conventionally understood, are declining. The users are moving to private group chats, but also that we're seeing that the mainstream platforms are more and more shifting. As users are fleeing, they're replacing users with AI-generated content, just both themselves intentionally, but also users are more and more actually just bots trying to spam content. So I will make arguments like that for arguing that this lens, this kind of epistemic understanding of digital media as being social is less and less apt for understanding or for describing our current moments, our current media landscape, and that we need new concepts, we need new methods to approach this. But let's start at the beginning and like kind of the question of, so what was the social media paradigm? How have we understood social media? Because I think that there's a lot of kind of implicit aspects of that that aren't always at the fore. And I always, when I talk to my students and so on, I always go back to the 90s because that's when I grew up. So I like going back there. But when social media first arrived, which you might recall, there was a lot of optimism. And why was that? I mean, in part because a lot of scholarship existed in this kind of in the wake of Habermas's influential book on the rise and fall of the public sphere. And Habermas, of course, wrote about how the printing press, newspapers, how they spread to coffee houses and were read aloud in Paris and in London and in the US, and that the debate sparked on reading those newspapers, reading those pamphlets, created what we then describe as a public, like the very notion of a public sphere. And so this, he argued, was really central to the emergence of democracy, to the American Revolution and so on. And it's really the foundation of having the public as a kind of counterforce to the king. But Habermas also wrote a kind of eulogy of this public sphere, because as broadcast media replaced newspapers and coffee houses, people retreated to their private sphere. They sat in their sofas with their family and watched television, and you didn't have this kind of public debate anymore. And so it was a retreat to the private sphere. And for him, that was a kind of retreat of democracy, where democracy became more theatrical and less founded in democratic debate. And so that was the context when social media kind of came on the scene. And so there was all of this hope that we would see a kind of regeneration. It seemed like a kind of new form of digital coffee houses, because everyone could participate. And in the same ways that we were discussing the news and the coffee houses, we could now discuss them in the comments, and there wasn't any gatekeepers and so on. And so there was this highly optimistic understanding of these communicative spaces. And while, like that has been kind of, very much criticized over the last 20 years, I would still argue that it's been a kind of paradigmatic in some sense, because it's like the definition of a paradigm is not necessarily that we agree with the points, but that they are like the central points that are being criticized and debated. So it's kind of central assumptions of the paradigm. And this also goes beyond just social media itself. This was also the era when we had, this optimistic period of disintermediation, peer-to-peer economy, the sharing economy, Wikipedia, and so on, and this early optimistic internet. And what happened to that one? Well, we had the rise of platforms, and so platforms was kind of a response to the sense that digital technology was a fundamental threat to capitalist accumulation. There was all of this optimistic, at least from the left optimistic, writing about how profits were no longer possible, how capitalism was no longer possible, because data could be copied for free. There was zero marginal costs. And basically that's the lens through which we can understand the rise of platforms, and as part of the kind of financial capitalist reformations after the 2008 great financial crisis. And since then, platformization has kind of defined both, I would say, both capitalism and the internet, and the two have been very much intertwined. So what's a platform? Well, basically, we can understand it as a form of proprietary market. So the realization was that whereas digital media enabled disintermediation, they also produced new forms of mediation, and that actually being in the position of the platform is an extremely powerful position, because users get locked in through network effects, and therefore we have a lot of infrastructural control. And through that, you can extract rent. And so through that, we saw the kind of shift from platforms like couchsurfing to platforms like Airbnb, which are based very much on this kind of extraction. And the one way that the platforms are profiting is by extracting rents. Right? Like that's how Airbnb makes most of their money. But the other way is through extracting data, because as being in between users and controlling this proprietary market, you can also extract data that you can use to improve your services, or you can use it for targeted advertising. And of course, this is like what Zuboff have written about in surveillance capitalism, this idea that like these data are incredibly powerful in shaping human behavior, and it's become like the forefront on large scale mass control, basically, which has led to data emerging as a form of capital or a form of central commodity of our era. As we hear all the time that, this and especially some years ago, this idea that just like oil was the natural resource for the industrial revolution, data is the natural resource for this new data digital capitalist revolution. And there's all of this literature on data colonialism and so on. I'm sure you're familiar with it. I think so. I recently written a paper on this question because it is quite striking, the question of whether these stories about the capacities of data, whether they're actually true. So can data actually control our behavior? There's actually very little. I looked into this, and there's actually very little evidence to show that this is the case. But I think that the important thing for understanding like the kind of platform era of the internet is that it doesn't actually matter, because within financial capitalism, the narrative, the narrative around the value of data is sufficient to instill financial value in the data. And as long as everyone believes in it, that value is real. And that in itself has led to the formation of the structure of basically our internet and our media system, and its kind of downstream consequences. So thinking of the context of social media, how has it been shaped by this platformization process? Well, basically the rise of algorithmic media, we can shift between the kind of talking about social media in the kind of post 2016, 2015 era and the kind of algorithmic social media that was more and more characterized the period after. It's centrally organized around the process of datafication, right? So this idea of we need to, like the way that they make money is to extract data about individual. That is the fundamental political economy within which platforms are situated and within which social media is situated. And I think it's important to think of like, that is the central aim, that like the valuable data extraction is the aim of platforms, that they're also spaces for social interaction is better understood as a kind of byproduct. So and I think my colleague Van Dijk and Thomas Pohl wrote really, really beautiful about this, how this aim of extracting data shapes everything about how social media platforms have been designed. So it's the fact that we have like, like that you like things, then the kind of network structure, the fact that you have like almost all social media platforms have like a little picture of you and then like, share something about yourself. The reason for those designs is that it's a very useful way to create data that is valuable for advertising, right? And of course, the second aspect of this is that it leads to an interest in engagement maximization. They want to optimize our attention, and they want to optimize how much we use the platform, because that's how they extract data, that's how they extract attention, which leads to a bias for attention-grabbing content. And it also structures, which we almost take for granted, but it is kind of, in some ways, something that is very characteristic of this era. The fact that these social media platforms create markets for users to compete for attention, right? Like that's basically how we can understand a social media platform. It's like any proprietary market, it's controlled by the platform, but what is being competed over is attention and engagement, right? And the platform sets the conditions for that competition, and then also sells the accumulated data and the accumulated attention on kind of back end markets that are largely invisible to users, but visible to companies interested in purchasing attention. And of course, like what we have found, I mean, I'm sure you're all much more aware of this than I am, but that the result of this downstream is that the focus on data extraction tends to undermine constructive dialogue, that the kind of Habermasian optimism was in part because of this undermined. So it tends to lead to emphasis of outrage, negativity bias, et cetera, et cetera. And I recently put out a little preprint using the PNAS data, just looking at the level of, if you look at effective polarization and your likelihood to post as a function of effective polarization, you tend to get these kind of graphs where basically the more angry you are about politics, the more likely you are to post about politics. And that creates a kind of misrepresentation, leads to false polarization where we think the other side is more extreme than they are. And I've written about this before as a kind of a trigger bubble. So not so much the filter bubble that we're not seeing the other side, but rather that we're seeing the most extreme representation of the other side, which leads to can trigger us in ways that itself can drive effective polarization or can drive an intensification of political conflict. So that was my very brief overview of the kind of like where we've been at in this sort of social media politics paradigm. I wanted to speak a little bit also about kind of growing interest in using LLMs and also thinking of how social media can be different. I think that that's in my reading of the field has been quite a lot of interest in thinking about how social media can be made more pro-social and more compatible with what we refer to as pro-social behavior. Of course, that raises all kinds of difficult questions about pro-social for whom and who has the right to define that. But there has been a lot of interest in kind of reshaping social media in more to enable more constructive forms of dialogue in recent years. And so I'm currently working in a 5-year PI of a 5-year project, trying to do precisely this. And so in this project, because the challenge, of course, is that, okay, if we use observational data, it's very hard to ask this type of what-if questions. It's very hard to think about, okay, what happens, how can we make social media better? How can we, if we change this aspect, will it lead to more positive outcomes in terms of our political dialogue, in terms of like the societal cohesion? That's very difficult using like observational data, right? And the way that we've previously looked at this, like we've used agent-based simulations, for instance, to look at this. But there are quite a bit of weaknesses with and problems with using agent-based simulation in the sense that agents tend to be represented, like humans tend to be represented with very simple rule followers, right? And so that has been criticized, especially within the social sciences, for not, capturing the kind of complexity of human behavior, and in particular in not being able to produce kind of discourse and not having reasoning abilities. So in my project is based around the idea of using large language models as stand-in for human behavior on social media platforms. And in this, I'll describe my most recent paper on this. And so basically here, what we were trying to do was to build a very simple social media platform and see if we could reproduce the problematic outcomes that we've seen in social media politics. And we point to, kind of looking at the literature, 3 different aspects of why Habermasian deliberation is challenging on existing social media platforms. One is the kind of like, okay, echo chambers. Of course, it's hotly debated the extent to which there are echo chambers, but there seems to be some prevalence on many platforms of a homogenization that, and anyway, there is broad agreement that you need to have diversity on platforms in order to have functioning political dialogue. Deliberation only functions if you have political diversity. The second one is what I call the social media prism, or what Chris Bale calls the social media prism. So this idea that the more extreme you are, the more likely you are to post. And there's domination of, like the more visible you are. So basically, there's a correlation between visibility and extremism. Which leads to this kind of trigger bubbles, these kind of cycles of misrepresenting politics. And the final is the inequality of attention, that social media has a tendency to become highly centralized around certain powerful actors. And so what we do in the study is basically build an artificial social media platform similar to Twitter, very minimal, and we create personas from the ANES data that describes an American individual, and this is like a representative sample of the US population. And we turn this statistical data into a persona text. So it describes an individual. This person is named John Smith. He's interested in hunting, fishing, and woodworking, etc., etc. Plus, we find out he's feeling for, there's a strong Republican supporter. He loves Republicans, Donald Trump, and Christians, NRA, etc., etc. And then we put these users on the platform. We allow them to post about things that they're interested in, to read other posts and react. And so I have several studies using this kind of baseline, but in this study, it's a very minimal platform. We don't have any kind of optimization algorithms for content or anything, but users can follow other users. They can repost messages from other users, and they can post their own messages. And what we're focusing on here is the resulting network structure. And our idea with the study is basically we wanted to see if we could create engagement algorithms, like see how difficult it would be to create a platform that would reproduce the problematic outcomes. And then we wanted to test a bunch of interventions to see if we could create a more pro-social platform. But to our surprise, we didn't need to put any algorithms in. We didn't really need to do anything, because already with this baseline platform, we saw these three features emerge from the dynamics of the platform, which we found quite surprising, and which suggests that it is fairly robust aspects. And I mean, to be fair, I mean, inequality that we have kind of preferential attachment, that this is a very stable dynamic that tends to occur in network systems, we kind of know that. I still found it a little bit surprising that it so easily emerged. Same with echo chambers, the fact that there's a tendency in the LLMs to follow users that are more similar to themselves, and that they reproduce known dynamics. Not super surprising again. I did, however, find the social media prism that this emerged was quite surprising, so that we have a strong correlation between that more polarized users tend to have more followers. And this really turned out to be a little bit of an emergent mechanism that we have actually discovered through this, because it turns out that, so we know that users are more likely to retweet messages in a polarized way. Like the choice to repost a message is a quite polarized choice. It tends, you don't repost something because you feel mad about it. You repost it because you feel strongly about it, right? And often because you're angry or outraged. So that's well known, right? But what we find here is that doesn't only lead to an overrepresentation of more polarized content on the platform, but it also shapes the follower structure. It shapes the network, because people tend to encounter messages because they're reposted, and they tend to be reposted because they're upsetting. And so that leads to a kind of feedback process where the networks that's constructed has built into it that it tends to be constructed based on more polarized content. And so that's the kind of dynamics that we're seeing. And so what we tried then was we tried out 6 different hypothesized interventions to try to address this, to try to reduce the level of, to make the platform more pro-social and address these 3 problematic outcomes that we identified. I won't go over them in too much detail, but I can say that they're quite extreme in some sense, because like I don't think you would want to be on a platform that implemented some of these. For instance, the downplay dominant voices. It literally highlights the least popular messages, which is like would be probably an awful platform to be on. This is like the least liked message on the platform. It's like, yeah, it's probably not an amazing message. But anyways, we wanted to do the most kind of extreme interventions we could think of. We also used like number 4 is the Google's jigsaws. They have like these bridging attributes that analyze content of text and then basically allows you to sort according to those, and as an alternative way of sorting newsfeed. And so what's the takeaway? Well, basically, some of the interventions do have some effect, as you would expect, but most of them have quite marginal effect on one attribute, and they often have negative effects on another attribute. So none of them really succeeds in addressing the problems. And you often have this kind of like, if you do a chronological newsfeed, actually it makes matter worse when it comes to the social media prism effect. So the platform becomes more polarizing. And so basically our takeaway is that like the problems of social media seem to be really quite robust and in our reading kind of built into the very structure of having a network where people follow each other and you repost and following ship in a network structure that these outcomes seem really connected to that core structure. And so the question we ended up with is kind of like, okay, so maybe we need a more fundamental rethinking of the structure of social media. And I would say also that like this is kind of one way in which the emergence of large language models changes and AI changes how we can study social media, right? It's the emergence of this type of methods. But what will turn next to is that they're also changing the object of study. And maybe actually in ways that allow us to move beyond this broader paradigm of a kind of social media network where we're following other users, we're sharing content, and we're competing for attention on the market. And I don't mean to say that in a way that it's going to be a positive change, but it seems like it will be a change. So to summarize a little bit of the kind of social media research paradigm and especially how it's structured our research, the social media paradigm has been very much defined by the notion that social media offers a kind of lens on social behavior, that allows us to study the public sphere and that it's individuals talking to each other. And that has kind of come to define this paradigm. Maybe it sounds trivial or obvious, but I think it's an important thing to make explicit. And so it's very much tied to this like digital trace data revolution, the kind of rise of computational social science, very much tied to network-based understandings of society. So this notion of society as being a social network is also very interlinked with the fact that society has become more like a social network because those technologies, those data representations are built into the platforms that are defining much of social life, right? And of course, it's also like created platforms as kind of field sites for studying social behavior and the use of kind of experiments and interventions, both on these platforms and more field-based experiments. So if that's the kind of understanding of the summary of the current kind of social media paradigm, let's turn to the question of this idea, my thesis here, that we're amidst the end of social media as we know it, or perhaps at least the beginning of the end. So I have some different kind of evidence for this strong and upsetting claim. So one is the fact that people just really don't like social media anymore. I guess this is kind of obvious, the kind of tech backlash and so on, but I do find it quite striking that in survey after survey, we see especially young people is saying that they would prefer if social media didn't exist. And that there's support even among young people for kind of digital curfews and limiting or not allowing social media or telephones in school. Which is it's an interesting thing, right? Because like, why are you using it if you hate it so much? But there is a sense that like the platforms have come to lock us in to this system that no one is really happy with, and that they've kind of managed to enclose the social and cultural commons of contemporary life in a way that no one is really happy with, but that is also really, it's a collective, it's a coordination problem to kind of to leave that paradigm and for that you would need politics. And so, but at the same time, we are also seeing users more and more leaving social media, not in as striking figures as the previous one, But this is again like my recent preprint I put up looking at shifts in social media over the last between 2020 and 2024 using the ANES data, and we see a quite large shift in the number of individuals who state that they use zero platforms, um, especially among the youngest cohort. So and ENS data only goes up down to 18 years old, but 18 to 29-year-olds have reported quite a large rise in non-use, and so do the oldest cohort, 65 plus. We can also see in looking at the specific platforms, we can see that the conventional kind of social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook are declining, whereas we see a rise in kind of TikTok. Instagram is kind of leveled out, but I think it's worth noting that Instagram has also kind of shifted to becoming more like TikTok, obviously, rather than being a kind of more conventional sharing platforms. But we do also see a rise in Reddit. But there is a general sense of a kind of falling rising number of people who don't use any social media platform. But even stronger, this is even more the case if you're looking at engagement, that there's just a huge rise in lurking relative to participation. Most Facebook and Twitter, sorry, X, posts get 0.15% interaction. And so what does that mean? Yeah, basically very few posts get any interaction whatsoever. And the amount of interaction and engagement on Instagram is also down quite radically, and TikTok, even though we saw it's growing in user base, it's not growing in terms of engagement. And the same thing in terms of actually trusting social media. People are less and less trusting what they see on platforms. So that's the kind of the other evidence that we're seeing falling use and falling trust and falling actually posting and engaging on the platforms. But I think that there's also a kind of shift in what the content is on the platforms, that it's getting harder and harder to think of this through a kind of public sphere lens, the sense that this would be somehow deliberative or engagement, like based on kind of political engagement, because we're seeing more and more content that's just pure attention optimization to such extent that it stops being narrative based. Even it's not even that it's not deliberative, it's not even narrative, it's just ASMR, so this kind of weird tingling and kind of it's been referred to as porn for other senses, because it's this weird tingling and immediate effects, sensorial effects, which it's very hard to bring together with a kind of Habermasian understanding of social media. And together, of course, and this is like not something that's very new, but the rise of short form video like TikTok, Instagram Reels, which is also abandoning both the narrative focus, but I would say also that it's shifting away from this kind of interactive producer paradigm where everyone is participating on equal terms, and becoming much more less of a social medium and more of a consumption medium, of a kind of a new form of broadcast medium. And of course, like the shrimp elephant in the room in all of this is the rise of AI, and what we might call the shrimp Jesus era of social media. I don't know if anyone were unfortunate enough to miss the shrimp Jesus moment on Facebook, but it's basically this point where AI generated images just started to go viral, and there was a lot of depictions of Jesus fused with or being represented through shrimps or crabs in kind of absurd ways. And it was received both as a kind of joke, but also by certain people actually thinking it was real, and there being a kind of sense that it didn't matter if it's real or not. And so basically the kind of foundation of AI slop and when it became a kind of obvious trend. And so this is the sense also that genuine human contact is again sidelined by algorithmic optimization for engagement optimization, but now also supercharged by the possibility to cheaply generate content that's optimized just for clicks. And so I have a hard time, just saying it directly, I have a hard time seeing a possibility for the old school participatory forms of social media in an era of large language models and AI production. I don't see that continuing. And now if you go to Facebook or you create a new user and you go to Twitter, very little of the content that you see with the user is created by a real person that is trying to say something real, is my sense. And so a response to this has also been the rise of chat groups, that people are fleeing this more and more AI slop spaces into more private chat groups. Also, I'm sure fleeing the kind of sense of polarization and conflict. And so we see the rise of kind of Patreon, Substack, Discord, but also WhatsApp. I guess less so in the US, but in Europe and in South America and large parts of the rest of the world, WhatsApp has really become the kind of WeChat platform used for everything, and the kind of baseline form of communication among both young people and old people. And also we see the shifts of kind of Instagram shifting to having a lot of kind of group-based discussions mixed with the video. So it's kind of you share a video, a meme among your friends, and you discuss it in private. And of course, this is driven by kind of that trust has really become the scarce resource with the rise of generative AI. You cannot trust any image that you see. You can't trust any content that you see, and so people are fleeing to spaces where that are controlled and where bots are not let in, because you have to pay to participate because they're paywalled and heavily moderated. But also that you're fleeing to trusting certain individuals and that you're fleeing to trusting certain brands. So like the rise of New York Times and so on. And of course, these are based on a different kind of logic. And so based on this, so we can see these three type of trends, like the AI slop platforms, and the rise of private group chats, and the rise of chatbots. And so what I will argue to the question which we came in with is how do we study digital media in the post-social media era? I would say that each of these three need their own kind of approaches and ways of study. So let's start with the first one. So how do we conceptualize AI slop platforms? Like Facebook is more and more coming, but also Sora, of course, there's directly designed for it. Basically, I would argue that this is to a certain degree going back to the pre-social media conceptualization of media. So kind of broadcast media visualization and shifting from thinking of this kind of social network, social graphs to kind of interest graphs. So we need to focus on what individuals are seeing and how that is moderated and shaped by algorithms, because these platforms are kind of like broadcast medias of the old, but now completely algorithmically controlled. And we're also seeing the return of the audience, which was, of course, like a central concept in media studies up until the 90s, basically. And because people are more and more acting as audiences rather than participants in conversations. And so we have to rethink what we're actually studying here. And this also changes the object of study from social networks and interaction patterns to being kind of what are people actually exposed to, how are they reacting to it, what is visible, and this is always the question of specific individuals, right? And so it's the question of kind of distributive analysis, how is the algorithm interacting with certain individual characteristics, and what downstream consequences does that lead to? And this is very centered on the question of individuals, right? Because this content is completely individualized, which also makes it quite hard to study in a lot of ways. Because we can't just look at the production of data, we need to look at the reach, what reaches whom, basically. One technique that I find quite interesting myself is the idea of using LLMs or AI to simulate users, simulate accounts, and track what they're exposed to. So basically having an AI be like a persona agent, go on the platform and then see what they're exposed to and see how different characteristics leads to different exposure. Um, so that would be the first kind of approach of studying AI slot platforms. Private group chats. So I think this is also really interesting, the rise, because in a lot of ways, this reproduces the Habermasian description of how we return to broadcast, like the rise of broadcast media, and we return to our sofas with our family, and we're discussing television with our friends. In the sense that like Instagram kind of functions like that at this point. Same with TikTok. You share reels with about some whatever meme with your close friends, and you discuss it in private. And of course, this really changes from a kind of performative wide audience communication to much more intimate and trust-based communication. Um, at the same time, we can still see a lot of these platform-based problems. So the idea that this would solve the problem of viral misinformation, for instance, does not seem to be the case, because we've seen in Brazil and India in elections where misinformation spread primarily via WhatsApp, and we have this in Brazilian Portuguese, we have the Tia do Zap. So this idea of um, uh, your aunt on WhatsApp, who is the main source for spreading misinformation in Brazil. So it's a way of making fun of the kind of, I guess, like the boomer on Facebook would be the equivalent in English. Um, of course, like the obvious problem with studying these private spaces is that data access, there's ethical and legal issues. Um, and even with kind of like data sharing, it's not necessarily ethically permitted to study the contents of these conversations. And there's also kind of a shift, I think, where we have to move away from the kind of God's eye view that was implicit in computational social science and studying social media to a kind of more situated, interpretive, participatory understanding, which I think can be quite productive and actually useful for computational social science. And it's also the question that these are like, how do you find a representative sample? How do you think about what these platforms are? And I think with this, we can hope to see the rise of more qualitative ethnographic approaches. Um, but I would say it's really difficult, and maybe you have better suggestions than I do on how to study these spaces. The third and the most interesting, I think, is the rise of looking at chatbots as a novel form of media. Uh, of course, like whereas our interaction with platforms have fallen, we've seen the explosive rise of interaction with chatbots, and they shape our worldview, our politics, our conceptions in many of the same ways that social media platforms did. They mediate knowledge and they shape our politics. And a lot of the kind of questions and problems that we were struggling with in relation to social media are reoccurring in very new forms in relation to chatbots. Um, and we're seeing the rise of a kind of new political economy, same way as I was just tracing social media and how it was shaped um, by the political economy of attention. So LLMs are shaped by their own political economy. So there's been some really excellent work on this already, on how competition between chatbots for users can lead to really problematic outcomes where they become more unsafe, even though it's not intended. And sycophancy is kind of one example of this, where it can have really problematic downstream outcomes. But users tend to choose chatbots that are more sycophant. And so there is this kind of internal, in the same way as social media produce such outcomes. So we see kind of problems that are market failures of the political economy of these platforms, just as with social media. And of course, like the questions that we were very much asking in relation to social media are revisiting us in relation to these platforms. Um, and the question of like what would be the methods of studying chatbots as a form of media? Uh, we've seen a lot of focus on experimental approaches, which I am personally quite excited about, and seeing how features of chatbots influence humans, individuals, and our worldview and trust and so on. Also observational, it's quite difficult to get these data. It has to kind of rely on data donations, but many of my colleagues are doing really amazing work on this. Also more kind of qualitative research, of course, and computational and audit-based studies, which I would say is still fairly early in finding ways of doing in a rigorous way. So kind of what we might call kind of talk-through methods instead of walk-through methods, but basically testing how by interacting with the models, how they their biases, their tendency to produce misinformation, and so on. But just to kind of close up, because I want to say that this moment that we're at, because it is a kind of a moment of pivot, a moment of transition with the rise of this new technology and arguably the decline of the conventional forms of social media, it is also a moment where things could actually, in theory, become better, not worse. It's rare for a social scientist to say, but there are all of this that I'm sure you've encountered this quite exciting experiments where people are using LLMs to try to actually improve democratic discourse in different ways. And so Art Geil and colleague created basically a chatbot that mediate between users to help them have conversations about polarized topics, such as gun control, and basically helps them rephrase things in a way to make it less polarizing. And they find really positive outcomes that actually, strange as it might sound, LLMs can help us see the humanity in others by mediating our conversations. And in a similar study, found that AI can also help democratic deliberation by again kind of moderating and shaping conversations. And so there is that kind of actually possibility of shaping more positive spaces. Of course, as we've seen in this talk, that really depends on having a political economy, having the economy and business models of these platforms actually being aligned with those interests. But I think we still have to see what business models these platforms and these companies running these AI models will converge on. So it's still a little bit early to speculate how this will play out. But that's it for now. I look forward to talking with you. But just to reiterate, my basic argument is this idea that platforms are no longer dependent on humans for content generation, and that we are therefore seeing this moment of transformation that we need to meet by new concepts, new methods, and by revisiting the kind of foundations of the field of social media studies. Yeah, looking forward to your questions. I guess I can stop sharing.
Peter, thank you so much for your presentation. We can get the questions now. I guess Phil can go first, then we can get Sengyan and Kaicheng.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Great talk. You raised lots of really important points that many of us are working on. I can't. We don't have enough time for all my questions. I'm sure somebody else, maybe Ozgur or others, will ask about the last bit that you talked about, which is like leveraging AI to study interventions and to do moderation. That's a really interesting thing. And I also would have questions about the claims of the decline of social media versus saturation, decline versus saturation. But I'm going to ask about the use of LLMs to model humans in simulations, because that's something that we've thought about a lot and discussed also in our lab. And I'm a skeptic, as you probably already know, so you probably expected this question. So first, like, is it necessary? Like, some of the things that you talked about in that paper, you could do with agent-based models without LLMs. You mentioned, we have models of preferential attachments that explain that. We have models on the emergence of polarization that explain that. We could probably come up with simple models also to explain the third effect that you talked about, which is, by the way, super interesting. So are they necessary? And then the second point is like, are they sufficient? Can you really draw conclusions from results that you find from simulations in which you have LLMs? And the reason I ask this is because for me, the most important point of agent-based models is that they're minimalistic, as you also mentioned, but that means that you control everything. And you can attribute any effect that you find to some specific mechanism or variable that you control. The moment that you have LLMs in the loop, that's no longer the case because there are billions of parameters that you cannot control. So it's basically a black box, and an LLM may have a certain behavior and you don't know what to attribute it to. And claiming that humans would behave exactly in that way assumes that you know exactly that these LLMs behave like humans, which we know not to be true. And you yourself mentioned some examples at the end, for example, psychophancy and all other kinds of biases that chatbots have. Yeah, so how do you think that using LLMs can be like a useful tool in this simulation approach, given those concerns?
So it might sound strange, but I'm also actually quite a bit of a skeptic of this approach. While I do think it's a very useful approach for getting research funding at the moment, I also am quite skeptical, and I'm becoming more skeptical as I work with it. And I've written a paper that's coming out in Artificial Intelligence Review any day now, basically arguing precisely what you were saying, that like large language models, they don't solve the problems of agent-based models, and actually they make the problems worse in a lot of ways, at least how we've been using them so far. And that, it makes them more kind of human-like than agent-based models, but not, but we don't have external validity, so we can't use them as empirical approaches. And whereas they're more kind of internally robust than empirical data, we don't know what they're doing. And so we can't use them as agent-based models. So basically they're this like weird methods that in between uses. So basically a method looking for use. Like one thing that I've was toying with, like, and talking to Michael Bernstein, like he's arguing for, using them to kind of for hypothesis generation. And so basically we can try something out and then we can use and either reproduce it with an agent-based model, which sounds really good. But when I try to do it, it's just like you have to make so many assumptions and simplifications when building the model that you basically end up, coming in with an hypothesis that you try to generate using the model to then be able to tell a story about how useful it was, but it wasn't. All that being said, I think that there is a space where they are still not sufficient, but they are necessary. And that is the space where some level of reasoning about the dynamics that you're in becomes important, and where the dynamics of having, social media imaginaries, algorithmic imaginaries, like these higher, like what's like second order cybernetics, as they would call it in the 50s. I think that space you can't explore using conventional agent-based models. And so I'm currently doing precisely that, kind of building a model where reasoning models are trying to figure out the dynamics of an algorithm on the platform. And that in itself leads to polarization. That does allow us to see a mechanism we wouldn't otherwise be able to see. So it is kind of necessary. And I think it can be simple enough to be sufficient for us to understand the mechanism, I think.
Thank you. I want to chat more with you later about that. I want to understand that better, but I want to leave time for others. But thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, Peter, and thanks for the great talk and like a lot of insights. And so I have a lot of questions, but I have to pick one. So I will pick one on the audience, the back to the audience on the AI slope media. So you told us about that, like, oh, maybe studying the AI slope media, we have to focus back on the audience. But like it is really is the thing. I totally agree with your point, but like is that the point really applicable only for the AI slop media? For me, it sounds like maybe TikTok or even for Twitter, there are a lot of lurkers. So those lurkers can be regarded as audience, right? So in that if in that sense, like do you still think like the audience, the AI slop media is kind of special compared to those other things? Maybe because of the affordances of like maybe creating the media and the AI kind of slop media as more challenging compared to TikTok or maybe Twitter. So I just want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. No, that's great. I think to clarify, I have like a maybe broader understanding of AI slop than most, because I think that also content that is just that is human generated, but that is just human generated in such a way that it's just adapted for the engagement algorithm to such extent that it ceases to be human. To me, that's still kind of AI slop, even if you're outsourcing the generation part. You still have the prediction algorithm, but you're outsourcing the generation part to human. Uh, I would say that it kind of converges to a certain extent. So I think it is a useful concept also for TikTok more broadly.
I guess I can maybe go next. Thank you so much for the talk. That was really great and really thought-provoking. I do have one, I guess, one quick question. What do you think about live stream forums and podcast? Do you consider them also as a sort of a social media or kind of a traditional like a media? Just wonder what you're thinking and how we should approach in terms of doing research about those platforms.
Yeah. I mean, I would to a certain degree categorize them as also a kind of return to a form of more private. So like that people are seeking more like trusted, building relationships to specific individuals and brands because they no longer feel trust more broadly. And so that creates kind of internal spaces. I think that there tends to be a lot of audience dynamics that becomes invisible there. Like we see a lot of content producers are very responsive to their audiences on whatever platform they're using for having audience response. And so there is a kind of the kind of group dynamics and polarization dynamics in those engagements, in those systems tend to feed back on the producers. And so, yeah, I think that very much fits in. And I think that this question of kind of pro-social relationships as an expression of people fleeing to brands and fleeing to more direct relationships has certain risks in this sense. And I'm also quite curious of this question of pro-social relationship in relation to large language models and to AI. Which I think is I haven't seen any research on it, but my sense is that is going to become more important as well.
We are at 1 o'clock. Do you have time for these last two questions or do you have to go?
I mean, I have all night.
Okay, then let's get these last two questions in.
Thanks so much. I agree with everyone. This has been super interesting. And I think I am maybe in the minority in this group because I don't come from a research background, but I am myself a digital marketer. So I'm really thinking through this on like a brand lens. And I'm very curious. So as a digital marketer, I agree with you very much, like anecdotally as well, that like Twitter and Facebook in particular are seeing quite the rise in AI slop content. But I'm also seeing some pushback, particularly on Instagram with folks, especially when it's fairly blatantly AI generated content of saying like, rushing to the comments and saying, boo, use real artists. This is clearly AI. You have this marketing budget. You should use it for real people. So I'm curious, especially looking at that graph that you shared earlier in the presentation of the decline of users on Twitter and Facebook versus still smaller but noticeable growth on Instagram and TikTok. Do you think there's a correlation there of AI generated content being particularly heavy on the platforms that were already hemorrhaging users versus on Instagram, where perhaps it's a little more visible, but also where there's still some growth happening?
I mean, it's really hard to say what is driving these changes because there's so many changes happening at the same time, right? And especially like Instagram really transitioning from being, photo sharing with your friends to being kind of TikTok, with some other features as well. And so, and it's also hard to say like how a platform like Instagram is responding, because I think it becomes such an individual question. This is like relating to the question of how do you actually study these platforms when they're different for everyone, and so how do you make a broader claim about who sees what and what the structure is? And yeah, I mean, also as in the comments, like YouTube is also TikTok now, right? Like it's all converging on one algorithmic slop feed. And so like I think for like Facebook's yeah, I have a hard time saying if it's how much is driven by AI slop. I think that there's like the combination between the user base and the where it's more older people who don't necessarily handle AI slop well. Let's just put it that way without offending anyone. Whereas like Instagram, there is all of this playfulness, and same with TikTok, there's a kind of a playfulness and an ironic way of interacting with AI slop that also allows it to be on the platform, and it enters into this postmodern, nothing is true, but nothing matters, so it's fine, which I think is dangerous on its own, but probably better than the Facebook tendency to just believe that Jesus actually resurrected as a as the crustacean.
Yeah, I guess I can go now. Thank you, Peter. So you ended with a very positive note that AI can assist people in democratic discourse. And I think with that, the assumption is that social media is still a networked media, right? And so I want to know, how do you square that with the previous finding that regardless of the interventions, regardless of algorithms, like a robust polarization emerges? And another thing is that with the paradigm shift that you mentioned, like, are there still spaces for this type of research, like about bridging algorithm, and how can you, yeah, make people have better discourse?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I think like I wouldn't make that assumption necessarily. I think like the way I would think about it is basically we've so far been thinking of what is a good platform, a bad platform, like pro-social, as if there's just one purpose. But we have a lot of purpose in life with communication and social interaction. And maybe we need to kind of split them. Maybe it's not a good idea to mix the aim of deliberation with community building, to mix politics and identity, because the affordances should be different for those platforms. And if you don't have different affordances, that can lead to really problematic outcomes, which we've seen with identity-based forms of politics. And so I think like LLMs have a lot of like much more than platform had. They have a lot of power to shape social interaction and to moderate conversations in both productive ways and in destructive ways. But to me, it seems clear that using that power, we could create platforms that are specifically directed for constructive deliberation. And so people who are interested in participating in constructive deliberation, which I know there are people who are, could go to those platforms and find that, whereas other platforms could afford other forms of interaction. Of course, that raises all types of difficult questions that I hope we don't have time to ask me.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll stop it here. Thanks.
Yeah, if I may, sorry, this may be one of the difficult questions that you were saying you were hoping no one would ask you, but this makes me wonder about like, so I feel like society in general has been struggling for a long time to try to find ways for sort of social like healthy social conversations and deliberative processes. And like, just because we may be able to improve things with AI, like, is that, I'm curious if you think that like, so it's very enticing that we would want to implement these things as we can sort of measure that there's some, positive output, but like, is it like a band-aid on a larger social problem that we should be potentially addressing in a different way? And is it maybe like distracting from like addressing the root cause? Or maybe the root cause is something that we can't fix, and therefore we should like leverage whatever we can from technology to help us.
Yeah. Wow. Difficult questions. I have a lot of opinions on that. I have a paper under review at the moment called "It's Not Polarization, It's the Radicalization of the Political Right," which I think maybe points to a little bit of my views on that, in the sense that like the polarization framing and the tendency of trying to depoliticize the conversation around the current political moment, and the tendency of emphasizing bridge building and more soft-spoken conversation. I do think that can be problematic in a lot of ways. At the same time, I do see the radicalization of politics as, in large extent, an expression of changes to our infrastructure of politics and social interaction, where identity building, like we talked about, like the fact that everything becomes a question of identity, because that's what's important for platforms to extract data about who you are, because that's the profitable data. So that leads to a tendency of emphasizing everything as an expression of identity and everything as an expression of conflict, which is great for extracting data, but it's also great if you want to create a kind of radicalized relationship to politics. But ultimately the tricky thing is that like there is no kind of neutral thing. Like it's very uncomfortable to have a discussion about how to shape the infrastructure of politics, of our society, of our cultural and social life in ways that it has good outcomes. Like who should have that power? It's a very uncomfortable conversation, but at the same time, we do have that power and we are doing it. It's just that we're leaving it to certain companies that whose interests are very poorly aligned with any kind of positive outcomes.
Awesome, thanks, and thanks for sticking around a little bit longer for all these questions.
No.
Great talk, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk, and we've been 10 minutes in. So we want to extend our thanks again, and let's wrap up here, I guess. And we have the recording, so we'll be sharing that too, if it's okay for you. And thank you all for joining.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was fun.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks so much.